The International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, ITER for short, was supposed to be the world's first nuclear fusion machine to generate net energy. But just last week, the project's leadership announced another delay and another price hike. Let's have a look at what happened and what that means for the future of nuclear fusion. ITER is the biggest international nuclear fusion project currently underway. It uses a tokamak design and construction has been underway in Cadarache, France since 2010. The tokamak is huge. It's about 10 meters wide and 11 meters high. That's a height of approximately 6 elephants if you stack them on top of each other, which is also a good illustration for the difficulty of pulling off this project. ITER's goal is to produce net energy in the reactor vessel, though if one takes into account the entire energy necessary to operate the reactor, ITER will still not produce net power. The main purpose of the machine is not to put power into the grid, but to collect data and to better understand how tokamaks work. Or at least that was the plan. I've always liked the idea that the world would come together on this mega project to save the planet, basically. But in reality, as so often, it didn't go according to plan. The first plasma run in the ITER vessel was originally scheduled for 2018, but in 2016 the ITER Council pushed it back to 2025. The project cost was originally estimated with 5 billion euros, but by 2020 it had risen to more than 20 billion euros. Where does the money come from? Like the Large Hadron Collider, ITER is located in Europe, but it's an international project at heart. About half of its funding comes from European countries, the rest from China, India, Japan, South Korea, Russia and the United States. So chances are your taxes went into it too. In 2020, COVID put construction at a pause, and just when it resumed, engineers found cracks in some of the already installed parts of the vessel. Unfortunately, these were indicative of a deeper problem, which was that some of the components which are produced by different companies didn't properly fit together. This creates stress in parts where there shouldn't be stress, causing helium leaks, corrosion and eventually cracks. Fixing this problem would mean taking some already installed elements apart again and reordering them. An engineer's nightmare. Since this news broke, it was clear that ITER would face further delays, but we didn't know until now how long it'd be. At a press conference 2 weeks ago, the new ITER director Pietro Barabasci announced that the first plasma run would be delayed from 2025 until 2034. That's a full 9 years. He also said that the cost would increase by a stunning 5 billion euros. Imagine having a job where you get $5 billion for being 9 years late. However, it isn't as bad as it sounds, because originally there was supposed to be a quite long pause between the first plasma run and the deuterium-tritium fusion, which is the main project goal. The latter has been shifted from 2035 to 2039, which is merely 4 years. So they've delayed the start of operation, but then shortened the research phase. Still, it's yet another delay, and it's a crucial one, because it puts the purpose of the entire project at question. You see, ITER was supposed to deliver data to inform other fusion projects, in no small part to encourage private investments to commercialize the technology. Now it looks like private companies are likely to pull ahead, which makes ITER kind of pointless. Is it still worth the money? I've so far been very supportive of ITER because while it's a high-cost project, it also has a high potential payoff. Now I'm not so sure if not others will just get there faster, reducing the payoff to essentially zero. I've in the past years followed nuclear fusion startups very closely, and at the moment I'd put my bet either on stellarators or inertial confinement to be the first to get nuclear fusion power into the grid. Stellarators are basically smaller, more efficient types of tokamaks. Inertial confinement means that you shoot at a fuel pellet to make it first implode and then explode explode. I went through all the different types of nuclear fusion machines and their pros and cons in an earlier video. Then again, maybe those startups will all fail. There's also the issue that private companies tend to be secretive with their data, so maybe a project like ITER is still needed. The ITER project will continue anyway, I'm sure, but at this point one has to ask whether it's not just throwing good money after bad. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Several universities in the United States have launched research programs on the spread of misinformation on social media. If that sounds like a good idea to you, figure this. They've been repeatedly sued by organizations on the political right who argue that what some scientists call misinformation isn't misinformation at all. They claim that research institutes are instead engaged in governmentally approved censorship campaigns. Let's have a look. This controversy in the United States focuses on two academic initiatives. The one was the Election Integrity Partnership that, according to their website, was a non-partisan coalition to empower the research community and others to defend our elections against those who seek to undermine them. To do this, they of course had to identify and single out what even counts as misinformation. They've not been shy about spelling it out. In this blog post, for example, they explicitly name organizations like True the Vote and Clean Elections USA and claim that they discourage voting by forming watch groups that are supposed to prevent some sort of fraud with ballot mules. A ballot mule is an individual who collects and submits multiple ballots. For a moment I thought maybe in Texas they literally put their ballots on mules. Who knows? The other initiative was the Virality Project that looked at COVID misinformation and produced a report that, according to their website, provides an analysis of social media platform policies and recommendations. If you look at the report, they analyzed what sort of misinformation went viral, and for this, of course, they also had to decide what is and isn't misinformation. Some examples of what they count as misinformation are the idea that public figures being filmed during vaccination were not actually vaccinated because the needles were retractable, that vaccinated people become magnetic, that vaccines contain graphene oxide that can be remotely activated, and that bonsai trees will sprout from the injection site. I made up the last one, but I wouldn't be surprised if people believe that as well. You might say that this is all obviously bullshit, but look, you're watching a science channel, so you're not exactly in the target group of this misinformation. Unless you've got a magnet sticking to your arm right now, in which case maybe switch to the Discovery Channel for a bit. But you see the problem here. All those examples were shared by millions of people. These millions of people who shared the stuff probably believed it to be true. So now you have some academic institutions going and just declaring, without much justification to be fair, that this and that is obviously wrong stuff being shared by crazy and stupid people. It doesn't go down well. Shocking, right? People don't like being called crazy and stupid. Who knew? Consequently, there have been various right-wing organizations trying to sue against these research programs. The two initiatives that I mentioned have already concluded, so you really have to understand those lawsuits as being means to prevent further similar initiatives. The most visible example of a right-wing organization taking issue with this research has been the Gateway Pundit, which sued, among others, scientists at the Stanford Internet Observatory in California who were working on those two projects I just mentioned. The lawsuit refers to this research as the largest mass surveillance and mass censorship program in American history. It alleges that scientists collaborated closely with government officials to monitor and censor disfavored viewpoints on social media, and that this government-private censorship consortium tramples on the First Amendment rights, privacy interests, and business expectations of millions of Americans. Imagine scientists working with the government. What's next? Doctors telling you how to stay healthy? There's another lawsuit that's been filed against the same researchers by the Republican Attorney General of Louisiana and Missouri on behalf of their states. The lawsuit alleges that the Biden administration has an open and explicit censorship program which has threatened and cajoled social media platforms for years to censor viewpoints and speakers disfavored by the left. Neither of these lawsuits has yet concluded, but would you be surprised to hear that the Stanford Internet Observatory, one of the places where scientists have been sued, seems to face funding challenges? 2 weeks ago, the tech website The Platformer wrote that the institute was being dismantled. In response, the institute put out a press release saying that this isn't true, but acknowledged that they have difficulties to get sufficient funding. So you can see the problem here. Americans are basically saying they have a right to be misinformed. And to be honest, from a legal perspective, I can see their point. Then again, it's not like the scientists actually withheld information. They just analyzed the data to understand what's going on and publish their results. But, well, that's America for you. Nothing says, we believe in free speech, like trying to stop people from saying things you don't like. We've all heard how artificial intelligence will supposedly bring giant boosts in productivity, take our jobs and kill us all, not necessarily in that order. Well, today I have some very interesting examples of anti-hype. Several business insiders think that AI isn't going to have remotely as big of an impact as others have said. Let's have a look. First, here are the optimists. Goldman Sachs, one of the leading global financial institutions, has said that AI could raise the global GDP by up to 7% in the next 10 years, adding about $7 trillion in value to the world economy. The consulting firm McKinsey is even more optimistic. It said that generative AI could add between $2.6 and $4.4 trillion to the global economy annually. And a survey at a conference at the Center for Economic Policy Research last year found that most of the attending economists expected a 4 to 6% GDP boost. Those are staggering numbers. $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. Soon we're talking real money. Reality is different because, at least so far, very few companies are seeing revenue from selling AI services. Yes, OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, is making money nicely and has reportedly now made it to $2 billion. Anthropic, the company behind Claude, expects about $850 million by the end of the year. For Meta and Microsoft, it's hard to say how much of their revenue comes from what source, so who knows. But besides those huge players, the only people who seem to be getting rich are hardware companies like Nvidia and TSMC, who produce microchips that are specially suited for AIs. The issue is that those few examples are driving a huge startup boom where everyone is cooking up their own AI for one or the other purpose. This is likely to be a bubble that'll burst soon. So here come the skeptics. First, there is Jim Covello, head of global equity research at Goldman Sachs. The issue he sees is that the upfront costs for AI are enormous and it'll be very difficult to get that much money back in. He says, "My main concern is that the substantial cost to develop and run AI technology means that AI applications must solve extremely complex and important problems for enterprises to earn an appropriate return on investment. We estimate that the AI infrastructure build-out will cost over $1 trillion in the next several years alone. So the crucial question is, what $1 trillion problem will AI solve? Basically, the issue is that if companies who provide AIs were to be profitable, it'll be less expensive to just stick with low-wage workers." Next, we have Daron Acemoglu from MIT, who recently published a paper in which he re-evaluates the impact of AI on the US economy. He says it'll be far lower than expected for two reasons. One is that not all jobs that can potentially be replaced by AI can be done by AI cheaper, so this is in line with what Corvello said. And even if AI can do a job cheaper, it won't be much cheaper. He estimates that from about 20% of all labor that could be replaced, only about a quarter, that is somewhat less than 5% on total, will be replaced, and the savings will be about 27%. At this point, you're looking at a GDP impact of 1% at most, far, far below the earlier optimistic estimates. Then there is David Kahn from the venture capital firm Sequoia Capital. He just published a short essay titled AI's $600 billion question that makes a similar point. He argues that there's a big gap between the revenue expectations implied by the AI infrastructure build-out and actual revenue growth in the AI ecosystem, which is also a proxy for end-user value. So they all think that for most AI startups, it'll either take much longer for revenue to materialize or it never will. As Kia Kokalicheva sums it up on Axios, either way, billions of dollars in capital is almost certain to be incinerated. I think that's probably right. As I've said a few times, the problem with AI is that to do them well, it takes a long time to train them, and then it takes a lot of effort to maintain them. This is why in the long run we'll have only a few very big companies being able to survive on the AI market, and you can see this already. It's basically OpenAI, Meta, Google, and maybe Anthropic, or the rest will be applications built onto that. Elon Musk is one of the few people who has a chance to catch up. And there are several governments who'd be very, very well advised to build their own AI now, or else they'll end up having to pick between either Musk or Zuckerberg. Hello. Hi, Elon. You know the $1 trillion problem. How interesting. What is it? How do I make $1 trillion? That's very deep, Elon. Well, if your AI becomes too expensive, you could just train a few cheap humans to pretend they're robots. They're also easier to fire. You're welcome. Bye. According to a recent poll by the United Nations, more than 80% of people worldwide want more action on climate change. According to Sabina, the poll would have been more instructive if they'd asked how much people are willing to pay for it. That there's a tension between great green goals and mundane monetary matters is particularly obvious when it comes to housing. Governments all over the world want house owners to make their buildings more energy efficient. Heat pumps are supposed to do it. Yet heat pumps are surprisingly controversial. I tried to figure out why and found a brilliant example for how to lie with statistics. Let's have a look. Exhibit A, an article in The Telegraph titled, "I'm tired of explaining to poorly informed Green voters heat pumps are awful." Its author Robert Tyler writes that even hardcore eco-warriors have reservations about them. He goes on to explain that heat pumps have a shoddy record in actually heating buildings, particularly older houses that millions of us live in. He probably has a collection of those "keep calm and carry on" posters. Exhibit B. Of course, the eco-warriors on Twitter don't agree. Here we have one of them claiming that the actual evidence suggests not. Over 80% are satisfied with their heat pump space and hot water heating, a satisfaction level similar to gas boilers, and that a recent governmental study found that all UK homes, from Victorian mid-terraces to pre-World War II semis and 1960s blocks or flats, are suitable for heat pumps. When was the Victorian era? From 1837 until 1901. A satisfaction level similar to gas boilers? Really? Yes, that's really what they claim. The website Carbon Brief, which is usually a highly reliable source of information, has a fact-check list on heat pumps, which rates the claim that heat pumps don't work in existing buildings as false. They also refer to a study that has allegedly found that there is no property type or architectural era that's unsuitable suitable for a heat pump, and there is no significant variation in performance based on house age. Middle Ages, Roman era, bring it on! Let me just say that I was a little skeptical, so I had a look at the data. But first, a few words on why it matters to get this right. Carbon dioxide emissions from residential heating make up 10 to 12% or so globally, a big chunk of the total. If we ever want to get to net zero, we have to figure out how to live more sustainably, and heat pumps are supposed to get us there. A heat pump is basically a type of electric heating. It uses electric energy to increase the temperature difference between the inside and outside of your house. The reason everyone is talking about them is that they're more energy efficient than the currently most widely used oil or gas heatings. They typically have half to a third of the energy needs of a typical fossil fuel heating. Carbon dioxide emissions depend on where that energy comes from, but an estimate from the USA says that they'd go down by a similar factor. So this is really substantial. The reason they're controversial is, well, that someone has to pay for them. And even with governmental support, the house owner is usually on the hook for most of the cost. And the issue is that on top of the heat pump, there might come other expenses. You see, the currently most widely used heat pumps produce much lower temperatures than a typical gas or oil heating. They might reach just about 50 degrees Celsius or so, while a typical gas or oil heating reaches 70 degrees or more. But the smaller the temperature difference between your radiator and the air in the room, the slower it'll heat. And if you have a poorly insulated house, it might just leak more heat than the heating provides, so it never gets warm. This is the problem that Taylor in his article is referring to. The issue can be fixed with two measures. One is changing the radiators to some that have a larger surface area. Typically, these are floor heatings. This is because the larger the surface area, the faster it can warm up the air. The other thing you can do is to improve the insulation of the house. Both are totally possible, but expensive. This issue is particularly pressing in regions with many old and poorly insulated houses that do see the occasional cold spell in the winter. While in the United States about 15% of households have adopted heat pumps already, in the UK it's barely 1% and in Germany roughly 2%. Sweden, Norway and Finland lead the way in adoption with 40% of households using heat pumps already. This is to no small part because they get really cold winters there, and so the houses in these countries are much better insulated to begin with. This all sounds quite obvious, but what's happened is that some people who think they're being particularly environmentally friendly are glossing over these problems. Let's look at these two claims that 80% of people are satisfied with their heat pumps and that even old homes are suitable for heat pumps, starting with the latter. First of all, it's worth saying that no one claims one can't install a heat pump into an old house. Of course you can. Put a heat pump in a Roman fort? Sure, go ahead. Just, cover up the whole thing with R38 fiberglass. More seriously, the question is, what else do you need to fix about the house for a heat pump to properly work? So I had a look at that governmental study in the UK, which is called the Electrification of Heat Demonstration Project. For this project, they installed about 700 heat pumps in England and Wales at governmental cost and saw how it went. The first thing we learned from the report is that 12% of properties surveyed were considered unfeasible, either because they didn't have enough space or the heat pumps wouldn't have heated the house or installing them would have been too expensive. Pro tip: it's much easier to find suitable properties if you disregard the non-suitable ones. I actually went to the UK Gov website and downloaded data for property ages and compared that with the distribution from the study. As you can see, they had far fewer old houses and instead more new ones in the study. This is a very common way to lie with statistics, to use a non-representative sample and then draw conclusions from it for the total. Okay, you might say, but look, they did have houses going back to 1920 at least. Yes, and if you look at the survey, it also tells you that new heat emitters were needed with 93% of the heat pumps installed, as the existing radiators would have been too small to achieve the necessary heat output. A new thermal store was installed in 81% of homes, and energy efficiency upgrades were made for 15% of properties. You know what? I think this study doesn't say what the eco-warriors think it says. Let's then look at the claim that 80% of house owners are satisfied with their heat pumps and that this is similar to the satisfaction with gas boilers. This comes from a survey done by the company Nesta in the UK. They recruited people who recently had one of the two devices newly installed. The report of the survey points out very clearly that the heat pump owners we surveyed were demographically very different to the gas boiler owners. For example, the heat pump users had larger, newer properties compared to the gas boiler users. And even so, around half of heat pump installations involved replacing the entire heating system, including new controls, new radiators, and new pipework. Only 5% of heat pump installations required no additional system components. So those 80% of people who are happy with their heat pumps are more likely to live in new houses, and 2/3 of them had to do further installations besides the heat pumps. And even leaving this aside, the 80% of people who voluntarily installed heat pumps already are happy doesn't mean that 80% of all people would be happy with a heat pump. It's like claiming if 80% of vegans are happy with their diet, 80% of people would be happy with a vegan diet. Clearly not. In summary, if you look at the data, it's pretty clear that heat pumps, at least so far, don't work well in old houses because they just don't get warm enough. This is why it's such a big deal that newer generations of heat pumps can reach much higher temperatures, pretty much as warm as gas boilers. I talked about this in an earlier video. Alas, if they reach higher temperatures, that'll probably mean they're less efficient, so the question is whether that'll still make environmental sense. I haven't seen good numbers on it, but I'll keep you up to date, so don't forget to subscribe. Someone recently alerted me to a press release from a company that says they found a new method of converting sunlight into electricity that's much more efficient than the currently existing solar cells. I've had a look. Before we talk about the new miracle tech, a quick thank you to all my supporters on Patreon, especially those of you in Tier 4 and higher. This channel would not be possible without your help. And you too can help us. Go check out our Patreon or join us right here on YouTube. Right, so the new product comes from a company called Vavya, and they call it a photon energy system. Their website has little information, but they've put out a promotional video, which you see here. My first reaction is that those are plastic spheres with some reflective material inside. Totally tangential, but the shape is a hexakis icosahedron. There seem to be holes atop the spheres, maybe also a lens. 3 things come to my mind immediately. First, if you want to collect sunlight, you don't want to use reflective material because, that reflects light. What they're doing by using this is effectively reducing the surface area where they collect light to this hole in the middle. Going by the size of the hole, that's at least a factor 30 or so smaller than what you'd get with a planar surface. Second, for the same reason, you don't want to use spheres because there'll be gaps between them and the light goes unused there. Third, even if there is a good reason to use spheres, you'd pack them in a hexagonal lattice to minimize gaps between them and not a square lattice, as you can see in the video. Though they might just have done that for demonstration purposes. Though this image has the same arrangement. Yeah, not sure what's going on there. They then say that the efficiency is 200 times higher than that of traditional solar panels.
PES is nearly 30 times smaller and generates 7.5 times the output. And it is over 200 times more efficient.
For context, commercial photovoltaics currently have an efficiency in the range of 15 to 20% or so. That number gives you the fraction of sunlight that they convert into electric power. While some materials have reached an efficiency exceeding 40%, these are not widely used because they tend to be both brittle and expensive. Concentrated solar power is when you focus sunlight with mirrors and generate electricity from the heat. These can reach efficiencies up to 25% or so. If the new system has a 200 times higher efficiency than the existing photovoltaics, that'd be about 3,000%. That means it outputs more energy than it takes in, which is not even theoretically possible. Big if true, but maybe I'm misunderstanding something. We then move on to some sort of demonstration in which they show that the system generates energy from LED flashlights.
It is important to note that the power meter will read 50% at the beginning of the demonstration due to the ambient lighting in the room. The power meter...
That is not a power meter, that's a multimeter, and it's obviously measuring voltage. I'm not sure who this person is who's narrating. She seems to be a little confused. The executive director and co-founder. All right, well, who's the CEO then? San Cheng? The same San Cheng who was arrested in China for buying toy guns and spent 3 years in prison. Quite a career. Okay, so look at this. The lower parts of the spheres are no longer illuminated. They previously were. Looks like there's something inside of them now. Maybe solar cells? How's the thing supposed to work? On Twitter, they write, PES doesn't just generate electricity, it captures sunlight using multiple layers of materials and special spheres and then converts it into electricity using a silicon conductor module. A silicon conductor module? I've never heard that. Let's look this up. So the only occurrences of the word come from the company's press release. But well, maybe one of their PR people messed something up. There is something called a silicon carbide module. That's a sort of power converter, which is indeed used in photovoltaics, so maybe that's what they meant. Actually, look, I found a patent application for the thing. This clarifies that it's indeed a hollow sphere with an opening and a lens in the opening whose purpose it is to collect sunlight. It also confirms that it's supposed to use silicon carbide. Totally tangential, but note that this is a different polyhedron than the one in the demonstration video. However, none of that explains how throwing away most of the incident light would improve efficiency. So look, I'm not saying that this is a scam. For legal reasons, I'd never even hint at the possibility that a product might be a scam. Indeed, I want to make it really clear that I've definitely not said it's a scam. But what do you think? Is it a scam? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.